Late one night, the movie begins at the Evans family's remote ranch where Dan Evans is awakened by the sound of his barn being set on fire. The arsonist warns Dan that he must pay a man named Hollander within a week or their house will be next. After the arsonist departs, Dan and his eldest son William rush into the burning barn to save their horses and belongings. While William goes back in for a saddle, Dan goes in to rescue him before the barn collapses, displaying his overprotective nature towards his sons, William and Mark. The following morning, Dan's wife Alice expresses surprise, believing their debt was settled, mostly to Hollander. Dan had paid off a portion of the debt, but needed to reserve some money for their necessities. Later, Dan, accompanied by William and Mark, sets out to retrieve some stray cattle, taking a piece of Alice's jewelry with him. On the other side of the canyon, Ben Wade sketched an owl when his gang informs him about a stagecoach full of money passing by for robbery. Ben completes his drawing and orchestrates the plan with Charlie Prince leading the charge on the wagon while he and a sharpshooter observe from the hills. Despite a moment of panic caused by a gunshot from Dan on the opposite side of the canyon, the crew resumes their attack plan. The wagon approaches and the men begin their assault. Unaware that a bounty hunter named Byron McElroy is among the passengers, rapidly taking down the robbers. Ben comes up with a plan to lure some cattle down from the hills and in the path of the wagon. The scheme is successful, causing the wagon to crash and sending McElroy and a few others flying. Charlie dismounts and eliminates all the men from the wagon, except for McElroy, whom Charlie shoots but is stopped from killing by Ben. The group seizes the money, but one surviving rider leaps out and holds one of Ben's men hostage. At that moment, Dan and his sons witness the scene. Ben promptly draws his gun and eliminates both the hostage taker and his own man. As Ben and his crew grab the money and make their way out, Dan confronts them because the cattle driven off the mountain belong to him. Ben offers to return the cattle but demands Dan and his son's horses to prevent them from reaching town to inform the marshal about the incident. Dan reluctantly agrees, and Ben rides off with his men and the money. After the robbery, Ben and his crew arrive at a nearby town called Bixby to execute Phase 2 of their plan. Charlie goes to the marshal's office and falsely claims to have witnessed Ben Wade committing the robbery and causing destruction. With all the officers leaving to investigate, the group convenes at the local saloon. Following some drinks and a toast to their fallen comrade, the men depart the saloon, leaving Ben to flirt with the waitress. Ben remarks that she reminds him of someone, and after some flirting, they kiss and retreat to the saloon's second floor. Meanwhile, Dan and his sons retrieve their horses, as it appears Ben returned them, and find McElroy barely alive. The marshals from Bixby arrive, and Dan recounts the entire ordeal to them. When asked which way Ben went, Dan misdirects them, stating they seem to be heading towards Bixby. When the lawman and Dan return to Bixby, Ben is still in the saloon sketching the waitress without clothes. They bring McElroy to Doc Potter to remove the bullet. In a humorous moment, it is revealed that Potter is more of an animal doctor than a human one. Meanwhile, Dan encounters Hollander and the individual who set fire to his barn, pleading for more time. The issue with Dan's land is its aridness, requiring funds to construct a well, yet Hollander refuses aid and heads to the saloon. Dan eventually arms himself and goes to the saloon to intimidate Hollander. Instead of Hollander, he encounters Ben. Ben promptly identifies Dan and inquires about retrieving his cattle/horses. Dan agrees, but seeks compensation for some deceased cattle. Ben hands him a few dollars, but Dan requests an additional $5 for causing him anxiety. Suddenly, the marshals show up and apprehend Ben. Speculations arise about Ben's punishment, hanging, and the arrangement to transfer him to contention, where he will catch the 310 train to Yuma en route to prison. Potter, McElroy, Tucker, and a railroad specialist named Butterfield are selected to accompany Ben to the train. Dan also offers to accompany Ben for $200. As they escort Ben to the stagecoach, Charlie and the other members of Ben's group arrive and start firing at the townsfolk. Swiftly getting Ben into the stagecoach, they drive away. Before departing for contention, the group pauses at Dan's homestead for supper. While dining, Ben inquires about a scar beneath Dan's eye. Mark begins recounting a tale of Dan defending the District of Columbia. A few minutes later, they go outside when Potter and Tucker begin shooting at something in the hills, with Charlie following. As the others leave, Ben engages in casual conversation with Alice, questioning if she has ever visited San Francisco. They have a pleasant conversation until Dan interrupts and instructs Alice not to engage with her. Alice then questions Dan about why he is accompanying Ben. He explains it is for financial reasons. After the meal, the group prepares for their journey. William expresses a desire to join, but Dan declines the request. Later that night, William secretly leaves to follow the group. As they set up camp for the night, Ben asks Dan to share his wartime experience and the injury he sustained to his leg. Dan threatens Ben when he makes a disrespectful remark about Alice. The others intervene to separate Dan and Ben before settling down to rest. Tucker's noisy behavior keeps Ben awake, leading to a confrontation that ends with Tucker dead. Ben used a fork he took from Dan's house. McElroy reacts angrily and attacks Ben, but they manage to restrain him and prepare to continue their journey. Elsewhere in the canyon, Charlie and his men locate a stagecoach they believe Ben is in. Discovering it is a decoy, Charlie sets the wagon ablaze and threatens the person inside with burning unless they provide information. The individual eventually gives in and discloses everything to Charlie, who still allows them to perish in the flames. Charlie informs the others that they are headed to contention. During their journey, Dan proposes to the group that they should take a quicker route despite Ben's warnings about Apache Indian territory along the way. While traversing the cliffs, Ben discovers that Dan lost his leg in a war and had it treated by the government. At this moment, McElroy intervenes, telling Ben to cease conversing with Dan. Unexpectedly, Ben gains the upper hand over McElroy, aiming a gun at his head. The rest heed and surrender their firearms as Ben pushes McElroy off the cliff, resulting in his death. Subsequently, William emerges behind Ben, pointing a gun at him. Despite Dan's frustration over William sneaking out, he has no choice but to allow William to accompany them. That night, the group is attacked by Apache Indians, but Ben grabs a gun and eliminates the threat, saving the other 4 men. The following day, Ben attempts another escape by stealing a horse and heading towards a location where a railroad is under construction. Seeking help, Ben pleads with one of the Chinese railroad workers to remove his handcuffs. However, the owners of the worksite recognize Ben immediately. Apparently, he had killed one of their relatives. Dan, Potter, William, and Butterfield catch up and are taken aback to witness Luke Wilson shocking a restrained Ben. Despite their efforts, the 2 railroad workers refuse to hand over Ben. Eventually, the group manages to retrieve Ben, but they are pursued on horseback through the caves. Tragically, one of the railroad workers shoots Potter as they flee. As they distance themselves, the men assist Potter off his horse, and in his final moments, Potter asks, "Did we escape?" Dan responds, "Yes, thanks to you." An hour after the group departs, Charlie and his men pass through the worksite, inquiring about Ben Wade's passage. When faced with resistance from Luke Wilson and the other worker, Charlie fatally shoots them before continuing their pursuit. At last, Dan, William, and Butterfield manage to bring Ben to Yuma and decide to hide him in a motel until the next train arrives later. As Dan keeps watch over Ben at the hotel, Ben offers to settle all of Dan's debts if he allows him to escape. Despite his hesitation, Dan ultimately refuses. When William rushes to the hotel with news of Ben's approaching gang, the tension rises. Upon arriving in Yuma, Charlie learns of Ben's whereabouts and requests to speak with him. Ben reassures Charlie from the window, suggesting they all head to the saloon for a drink. Plotting a malicious scheme, Charlie offers a reward of $200 to anyone willing to help eliminate the guards around Ben. The marshals show cowardice, declaring their resignation to Dan and Butterfield before stepping outside, only to meet a tragic fate. Dan faces a dilemma as Butterfield contemplates releasing Ben in exchange for the promised reward. Despite the offer, Dan remains steadfast in seeking justice for Ben Wade. Assigning William to stay with Butterfield, Dan entrusts him with jewelry taken from Alice, instructing William to return it to her in case he doesn't survive. But William, rebellious by nature, eventually abandons Butterfield to assist his father. A fierce confrontation ensues. Dan's attempt to secretly escort Ben out is thwarted by waiting sharpshooters. In a desperate bid for survival, Dan embarks on a shooting spree through town, evading bullets and taking down adversaries. Angered by the townspeople turning against Ben, Charlie retaliates by firing upon them, escalating the chaos further. Ben and Dan seek refuge in a general store, where Ben overpowers Dan and tries to escape once more. In a gripping moment, Dan, struggling for air, confesses to Ben that he is not a hero but a man haunted by the memory of losing his leg to friendly fire during the Civil War. He explains that his main motivation for escorting Ben is to earn back the respect of his sons, who were disheartened by his past. Moved by Dan's vulnerability, Ben decides to cooperate, and together they navigate the rooftops to evade the pursuing posse. Despite the posse's relentless gunfire, Dan and Ben manage to reach the train station. As they wait for the train, scheduled for 3:10 p.m. but delayed, Charlie and his posse surround the station, trapping Dan inside. Within the station, Dan reveals to Ben that his son Mark suffers from tuberculosis, requiring the dry climate provided by their remote ranch location. This revelation deepens Ben's understanding of Dan's motives and fosters a sense of trust between them. Despite the train's arrival, the posse's block prevents Dan from boarding Ben. Unexpectedly, William intervenes by releasing a gate, causing chaos as the cattle stampede distracts Charlie, allowing Dan to secure Ben on the train. With a heartfelt farewell from Ben, Dan faces a sudden attack from Charlie, who fatally wounds him. In a twist of fate, Ben seizes control by eliminating Charlie and his entire posse, standing in disbelief over Dan's lifeless body before departing to freedom. He shoots Charlie in his existing wound, taking his life. William rushes to Dan's side, filled with admiration for his father's feat of getting Ben to the train before Dan passes away quietly. With a conflicted heart, William aims Dan's gun at Ben but cannot go through with the act, knowing that Dan's death was not Ben's direct fault. As William grieves his father's loss, Ben boards the 3:10 train bound for Yuma, beginning his journey to prison. As the train departs, Ben whistles for his horse, which follows the train, hinting at Ben's potential escape. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell if you want to watch more videos like this. Thank you for watching and see you again soon. Take care.